Okay, so I may be a little late to the party here, but Starfield was pretty awful, right? I've been a fan of Bethesda games ever since my first foray into Morrowind many moons ago, but there's just no denying that Starfield was a prime example of developers being so entrenched in the idea of asking if they could do something that they forgot to ask themselves if they actually should. And this, in a nutshell, is what I want to talk about today, because I think it's a question that many AAA developers haven't had to ask themselves for a long time now, and we may be approaching the era of scaling back within gaming. The late 2000s and the vast majority of the 2010s were a period where, pretty much without exclusion, bigger was always better. And not to give them all the screen time, but we have Bethesda to blame for that too. Skyrim was the catalyst, a game that essentially taught all corporate bigwigs that if you offered an open world with endless things to do and map markers in abundance, you'd essentially be printing money, and for the longest time, that is exactly what happened. This was because we were entering a new era of gaming where the technological advances were so drastic that even the most poorly realised and sparse open world still felt pretty impressive. You could probably count on one hand the open world games from that era that actually failed. However, over a decade on, we as a collective have become wise to the lazy and formulaic tricks that have netted AAA companies so much cash in the past, and we are rushing to the doctor to get something to treat our open world fatigue. But as is often the case, the indie gaming scene is well ahead of the curve and understand what the gaming masses want. You guys don't want to say goodbye to open worlds forever, and you don't want to bid farewell to the feeling of endless possibilities and player agency. You just want some structure, some boundaries, and not to be stood paralysed in place because a random NPC just handed you your 9th side quest in as many minutes. And it may not feel like it yet, as the AAA companies are still trying in vain to create a new live service hit, but we are in the era of scaling back. So let's discuss how we got here. Before we discuss where indie games have succeeded in offering concentrated games with an open-ended feel, we need to talk about the AAA industry repeatedly dropping the ball, forcing indie developers' hands. Ultimately, the big guys in gaming have really dented the reputation of open world games over the last few years through one thing: streamlining. Creating an open world isn't so much about building a world from the ground up anymore. It used to be a process where writers and artists would build a rich tapestry of lore, create interesting landmarks to densely pack into the world, and then from there, the seed would blossom into a beautiful and engrossing landscape. However, as companies tend to do when they smell blood, they have cleverly managed expectations of gamers to expect less until a game is patched after release, and they have created systems that allow them to create large-scale worlds quicker than ever before through formulaic practices. So what that means is we tend to get a lukewarm Assassin's Creed game every year, and Sony exclusives that hide behind competent writing but aren't even that much better. At this point, we've been sold every lazy angle in the book, like Assassin's Creed Mirage going back to its roots, which essentially meant a safe, basic and underwhelming annual release for the franchise. We've also been sold the idea of infinite worlds where procedural generation is king, which Starfield and No Man's Sky both showed isn't all it's cracked up to be. And then of course there have been games that have promised us the world and came up laughably short, and Cyberpunk 2077's launch is probably still the best example of that. In short, big games have been getting bigger, and not because they want to add value or because they feel like making their world more impressive, but more or less because they're looking over their shoulder at competitors and wondering if their new open world has a few square miles more landmass than theirs. Thankfully though, the indie gaming scene hasn't been sucked into this black void of creativity, and in fact a lot of indie games have been doing the opposite, aiming to provide concentrated versions of what the AAA scene has been trying in vain to accomplish. Does this mean that indie games have been creating open worlds to rival the AAA companies? No, that is not what's been happening. This actually started pretty small, with developers way back in the days of the AAA open world boom attempting to offer that innate sense of freedom these games provide, but on a budget. And examples of indie developers stripping things back can be seen in a lot of modern indie titles. For example, instead of the hyper-intensive focus on crafting and building bases like we have seen pushed hard in games like Fallout 4 for example, we had games like Spiritfarer, where players were given a much boiled down version where they could stack buildings one on top of the other. The actual building and crafting within this game are simple and lack the depth of many AAA games, and yet if you head over to the Spiritfarer subreddit, you will still find players sharing their final boat layouts today. Then as for the open world problem of the abundance of map markers we see in every AAA game today, indie games began stripping these back altogether to ensure players felt guided when needed, but ultimately were trusted to find their own way and choose their own path. Hollow Knight is a great example of this, as it leads the player through the initial stages of the game with environmental clues and subtle nods, and the only traditional map markers you'll find are the ones leading to the 3 dreamers across the map you'll need to beat if you want to fight the final boss. And believe me when I say, those map markers will not necessarily dictate the route to the finish that you take. And then as for the choice paralysis that I feel every time I try to play The Witcher 3 again, an indie game that tackles this beautifully is A Short Hike. It is a game where there are side activities to take on and an open world to explore, but you have one clear goal, and that is simply to reach the top of the mountain to get cell phone reception. All of these games are undoubtedly smaller projects than the AAA games we've mentioned already, with smaller budgets and fewer employees with less experience working with open world formats. Yet, you would argue that all 3 of these games do a better job at delivering an open-ended and immersive experience than, say, Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora or Forspoken. It's this ability to hyper-focus on aspects of games that the developers know will be adored by fans and accept that less is more in other areas of the game that makes these games so excellent. And after a decade now of extreme open-world bloat, where almost every major game is trying to be a little bit of everything, I think there's a change coming. So what does this change look like? Well, if I look into my crystal ball, I think it's going to come down to 3 main factors when games are in development. Firstly, we're going to see a lot of smaller open world games and even some more structured pseudo-open worlds with more clear boundaries. It's become clear to me that gamers of this era crave structure with their open worlds. They want clear objectives, densely packed and interesting areas rather than loads of sparse and lifeless towns and cities. And they want things to get sidetracked with that feel natural and contextual, rather than a map marker indicating a collectible is nearby. Great examples of these pocket open worlds are A Short Hike, Little Gator Game, Outer Wilds, and there's so many more, which showcase that big isn't always better, and most of the time, letting players off the leash and trusting them to find their own way leads to a richer and more rewarding experience. Secondly, I see a future where many more games start giving players cool systems and assets to play around with, but ultimately leave how the player used these assets up to them. This would essentially eliminate rigid crafting and replace it with a sandbox approach to construction. It's ironically something that is best shown by a AAA game in the form of Tears of the Kingdom, as this open world relies on the strong foundation of Breath of the Wild and then enriches the experience through mind-blowing construction and physics, allowing players to build rockets, mechs, hovercrafts, and so much more. But even this can be shown through indie projects like Pacific Drive or Kerbal Space Program, where construction or survival mechanics are flipped on their head to offer something new that feels a lot more like a sandbox playground. Then thirdly, as the bubble inches closer to bursting when it comes to live service games and mega budget games that can't recoup their staggering investments despite astronomical sales figures, like the vastly successful Marvel Spider-Man 2 for example, it feels inevitable that major publishers and studios will begin to send out breakout teams and acquire smaller studios with the intention of creating games with an indie feel, but with the budget of a huge AAA studio to take this to the nth degree. We've already seen this sort of thing courtesy of Nexon with 2 big budget projects like Lies of P and Dave the Diver masquerading as indies, not to mention EA and Bethesda with games like It Takes Two and Hi-Fi Rush respectively. As we wrap things up, it's rare that I come to the end of a rant like this and come away with a positive feeling, but in this case I really do feel optimistic. And yes, sure, this is only happening because we as consumers have finally had enough, combined with the fact that major studios aren't seeing the profit margins they once were. But no matter how we got there, I think this scale back approach where we get more polished, concentrated games without bloat is exactly what the industry needs right now. And this opportunity to hyper-focus on new ideas in a vacuum without needing to throw in all the usual staples that we have come to expect from an era gone by can only be a good thing. Sure, there will be exceptions to the rule as we stare down the barrel of a GTA 6 release in the near future, which seems just too big to fail, and maybe that will be the peak of where open world games can go. However, I think this is the time to scale back and focus on the next big thing. Sometimes you have to take a step back to move forward. So there you have it, guys, my thoughts on the new era of gaming that we may be moving into. What did you make of this one? Did you like my take? Do you have a different viewpoint? Do you have any games that you feel are really bucking this trend or really leaning into this trend? I would love to hear all of your thoughts, and if you could like, comment and subscribe to the channel, it would mean the world to me. Your support so far has been incredible and I just want to keep that ball rolling, so please do your bit for the IGC community, and until next time, I've been Cal, and I'll see you then.